and thank you for coming. Before I get started, I do have to call out my esteemed colleague, Tara Godinho, because this study will talk a little bit about kind of how it started, but she was heavily involved when we did the pilot study, and she's here today, and I just wanted to acknowledge her expertise in kind of how the study got started. So, as Eileen said, my name is Ariane, and I am going to talk a little bit today. Can everyone hear me all right without the microphone? It can get a little echoey in this room. About some recent research that we've been doing here at the Haring Center that's examining how we can use mobile technologies to teach specific skills to young children with disabilities. So, let's talk about the context for this research, why this might be an important thing for us to be thinking about in early childhood education and here at the Haring Center. Well, first of all, we know that the number of children with disabilities is increasing every year, particularly the number of children with autism. So 2013, the CDC did another kind of nationwide study where they were looking at the rates of autism across a number of different sites, and the new numbers are 1 in 68. This was a kind of increase from 1 in 88, prior to that 1 in 144 in the early 2000s. So we are seeing these numbers kind of increase systematically every time the CDC does a new study. We know that each incoming kindergarten class is more diverse than the kindergarten class before it. So we see a wide range of strengths and needs as our children are entering the educational system. We also know that given this, right, we have the need for really sustainable and easy to use interventions that we can use as teachers, that families can use at home, and that practitioners can use in the community. We need to be finding easy things that are effective and that work for everyone. We know that visual supports are one such intervention. There is such a wealth of compelling literature that examines the use of visuals for children with autism, for adults with autism, for a wide range of people with disabilities. But there are also some barriers to visuals too, and we'll talk about those. But finally, the recent advances in mobile technology seems like this has really expanded our opportunities as practitioners and teachers and for families to use these technologies at home. So let's start by kind of diving into visuals, and then we'll talk about mobile technologies, and finally we'll talk about how children learn to remember. So visuals, right? Many of us here, I see there's a number of graduate students in the audience, not so recent graduate students, but everyone in this room is highly educated, and we all know that visual supports are an evidence-based practice. There's a wealth of compelling data and literature that suggests that these really work for children with disabilities. And just a reminder, visual supports are line drawings, the photographs, the symbols, videos, video modeling can be considered a visual support as well, that we might implement as a way to remind children to do something, or to keep someone on task, or to support a child in initiating with a friend. So visuals can really be used to serve a number of different functions for children with disabilities. And we get a lot of bang for our buck from visuals. When we use them with fidelity and really consistently, we see increases in appropriate behavior and decreases in challenging behavior. But it's also important for us to keep in mind that we use visuals in our lives as highly successful adults all the time. I'm sure many of us woke up this morning and checked the email and then look at our calendars, right, and see what is on the agenda today? Where do I need to be? Do I have class this evening? Does my kid need to be somewhere? What am I doing after work? We check in with our calendar on a regular basis to remain timely and productive. Many of us regularly use our smartphones to check in on our calendars. Is that the case with anyone in this room? I'm sure all of us are now using mobile calendars as opposed to paper calendars. There's many other apps on here that help us remain timely and productive, right? Notes are a big one. I am one of those people, I tend to carry multiple different bags. Maybe some of you do the same thing. You've got a work bag and a gem bag and a other bag. And I take my wallet out of one, I put it in another, and then I'll forget to transfer it to the original bag, and then I pull up to the gas station and I say my wallet, right? So my husband's created a visual support that says wallet in giant red letters, and he's taped it on our front door, and this is supposed to be my visual to remember to grab my wallet out of whichever bag it started in and put it in the bag that I currently have. And sometimes this is more effective than other times. To-do lists are a big one. We use to-do lists in our productive lives as adults all the time, but we might not necessarily teach a child with a disability how to develop a to-do list so they can remain as productive as we hope they might be. Maps are a big one too. I'm not sure if anyone is new to this area. I find myself on the east side a lot for my other job, and I'm not familiar with that part of town, and I wouldn't be able to get to the home visits I need to get to over there and to get to the school sites if it were not for the map on my phone and being able to check in with Siri and find out where I need to go. And then finally, a traditional planner. I'm always shocked that I have several graduate students that use these on a regular basis and find them very effective, more so than mobile technologies. But what I want us to kind of think about with all of these examples is that we, as productive and successful adults, use visuals all the time. And they help us be the most successful grown-ups we can be. And it's just as important for us to teach children with disabilities how to access this. But we also know that there are barriers to visuals, and they can be challenging for families to use in the community and when they're out kind of running errands in their day-to-day lives. So Donato et al. Recently did a study where they created focus groups of practitioners. So these were parents of children with disabilities, occupational therapists, speech and language pathologists, and special educators. And they got these people together and they wanted to find out, what do consumers of visual supports think about them? What works with visuals and what's challenging about this intervention? And what they found is there were several barriers, and I'm sure all of us that have used visuals in our practice as teachers can identify with these. So both families and practitioners noted that a lack of time was a big one. So if any of you have made visual schedules, and I'm sure many of us in this room have, it does take some time. You need to look up the images. If you're unfamiliar with BoardMaker, and some of us might be still learning it, it does take a while to navigate through that program. If you're using Google Images, you need to download them, all of that. We also know that the families of children with disabilities identify as being time poor, and many teachers also identify as such. So this is a population that might not have a lot of spare time to begin with, and yet the expectation is that they might be creating these things for their child to use in other environments, and they frankly might not have the time to do so. Resources is another one, and we're lucky enough here at the Haring Center to not struggle with that as much as other centers do. We have laminate, we have color printers, we have Velcro, we have what we need to create these visuals in the most effective ways possible, but our colleagues in other school districts and our families at home might not have access to those things. And we all know that visuals are going to be much more sustainable and durable if we can laminate them. We also know that laminate is incredibly expensive, and a laminator is expensive. And if the one here breaks all the time, what does that mean for like the $30 one that the parent we're trying to support got on Amazon? So resources to create these visuals is a big issue. And then finally, awareness. So families often might not be aware and have the training that we have on what they can be using and what these visuals can look like. I think teachers think really creatively about their visuals, and they don't always look the same. They're created individually to meet the individual needs of a child. And families without that training struggle with this. And in these focus groups talked a lot about, well, I know that going to the park is really hard, but I don't know how to make a visual around that. No one's taught me. How do I do that? Families were just unaware of what that visual could look like. Another thing that came up in these focus groups was the issue of inconsistency. So we know that children with disabilities often comes with very large teams, right? There's a number of different practitioners that work with an individual child. Children might be spending time across different sites. Maybe they're going to grandma's for daycare or a community daycare center. They're home, they're at school, they're going to OT, and having consistent use of the same visual across those sites can be a huge challenge for our families. And that came up a lot in this study. And then finally, several parents talked about experiencing other people in the community demonstrating kind of negative attitudes when they were getting out a visual schedule to support their child, who, one example was a kid having kind of a tantrum, engaging in some challenging behavior at a neighborhood pizza restaurant. And the mom had some visuals in her bag and was getting out an appropriate protesting board and was getting some odd looks from other patrons at the restaurant who weren't familiar with this methodology and this intervention and weren't quite sure what this mom was doing. And she shared in the focus group kind of like, that's the last thing I need. My kid's having a meltdown, we're trying to have a family dinner. And here people are looking at me like I'm doing something weird because I'm trying to support my child using a picture. So these are things that came up not only with families, but also with practitioners. We know visual supports are really effective, but it's important to keep in mind that there are barriers to these as well. So this photo kind of made me laugh. Some of us might be familiar familiar, this is a celebrity. Her name is Katie Holmes. Her daughter's name is Siri. And here we see Siri is kind of having a hard time. We're not quite sure why. Mom said ice cream, who knows? And in this situation, Mom might be thinking, like, darn it, if I only had the choice board, we could have avoided this challenging behavior. And this is something many of us who work with young children with disabilities have been in this situation before. You're with a kid, you're in the park, you're in the car, you're on the bus, whatever, you don't have the schedule or you don't have your appropriate protesting board, you don't have the visual that you need to support this child and prevent the challenging behavior from happening, much like poor Katie Holmes and her daughter Siri. So this is an issue with traditional visuals, and this is where we might be able to consider the use of mobile technologies. So mobile technologies can include smartphones, MP3 players that have built-in cameras, handheld cameras like flip phones or tablets. And what is fascinating about mobile technologies is, first and foremost, we see them everywhere now, right? Over 91% of adult Americans that responded to this nationwide study completed by the Pew Internet Project responded that they had a cell phone. For adults that are between the ages of 25 and 34 and 35 and 44, those numbers are even higher. It's 96 and 97%. So almost everyone that falls into the age range of most parents of young children in early childhood programs are using cell phones on a regular basis. 58% of adults own a smartphone, and 42% of us own tablets. So this data kind of supports that we are seeing these mobile technologies in the homes all over the place. Another interesting thing to consider is that adults, we're using our cell phones not as phones first. The first thing we're doing on cell phones is actually texting. Then we're checking email, then we're using other apps to help us figure out what's around us, like the Yelp app is a good example of this. If I'm in a new neighborhood, I might be using that as a way to determine where the closest gas station is or where I might be able to take my family to dinner. Then we're also using cell phones for checking things online, browsing the internet, and listen to music. And then finally, people are using them to actually make and receive phone calls. So we're using these mobile technologies in many other ways aside from making calls on them. In schools, we're seeing an increased emphasis as well. So the Los Angeles Unified School District, which is a very large school district, underwent what they're calling a digital conversion in 2013. So what they did there was every single child, kindergarten through grade 12, was issued an iPad at the beginning of the year. Every single kid. The iPad went home, it came to school, and that was what children used to participate in school the way they would use a textbook, right? A school district in New Jersey piloted a very similar program using a technology created by Google called Chromebooks. And the cool thing about Chromebooks is that teachers, if I'm teaching second grade, I would have my Chromebook. All my students would have one as well, and I can sync the content that they are accessing to mine. So if I'm teaching about the weather, I could download whatever curriculum I wanted to use that's addressing weather and sync all of my students' Chromebooks to do the same thing. And kids are using those Chromebooks the same way that they might use a textbook, but they're much more interactive. In another study, another nationwide study that surveyed kind of technology officials in school districts, 80% of people surveyed said that they planned on using iPads in the next 2 years, and that was in 2013. So we really are seeing more and more emphasis on this nationwide in schools. Individuals with autism kind of have their own market when it comes to technology as well. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this, but there's a number of different apps specifically targeted towards kids with autism. We know that several studies have identified the use of technologies and tablets as a way to teach vocational skills, as a way to support challenging behavior. Language is a big one that we use mobile technologies for. And finally, social communication and behavioral support. There's also several apps, and some of you might be using them now. I know there's some people working in the data project here that are just for tracking the behavior of individuals with autism. So kind of this population has its own sort of narrow focus, and there's a lot of marketing that's going into these apps, specifically for kids, for families of children with autism. And finally, we come to early childhood classrooms, and we are seeing an emphasis on technology here as well. This image right here is actually the Teaching Strategies Gold app, and this can be downloaded on Apple and Android products, and it's a way that teachers are collecting data and documenting what young children in early childhood programs are doing in the classroom. Studies have also documented the use of tablets and smartphones as as a way for teachers to take photos and videos of children and include that in their portfolio, and a way for them to collect data. So we're not just seeing the use of technologies with kind of big kids, we're seeing it in early childhood as well. Another thing for us to consider is that the NAUIC, and for some reason we're missing a little bit here, and the Fred Rogers Center for Children's Media in 2012 developed a joint position statement. So they got together and they developed a kind of a document that talks about how technology can be used in early childhood classrooms. And this document really promoted the use of technology. And these two organizations came together to say, basically, hey, we can use technology in creative ways to extend the traditional learning opportunities that are present for young kids in the classroom and be using this in other ways. And I think this quote kind of encompasses what we were thinking about when we designed this study, that technology can also help children save, document, revisit, and share their real life experiences through images, through stories, and through sounds. So it kind of gives us another way to be supporting young children with and without disabilities in the classroom and helping them develop their thoughts and access their curriculum. So that brings us to the questions that we're trying to answer with this study. First and foremost, we are really interested in seeing how can these technologies be used to actually teach. It seems like iPads and smartphones can be really fun but really expensive toys or reinforcers for young children with disabilities. And how can we move from using this as a reinforcer to using it as an instructional tool? And the specific skill that we're targeting in this study is teaching kids to accurately recall what they've done during the day. So can we use mobile technologies to support that skill in young children with disabilities? And is there a way that these visuals, is there a way to create visuals that might change the way children are recalling their day? And when a parent asks a child, how was your day at preschool? What did you do? And they can use a visual, a photograph that a teacher's taken of a kid in preschool as a visual support. Does that change the way kids can talk about their day? Do they use different language? Do they use different words? Are they able to talk more, or do they talk less? What does that communication look like? And finally, parents are the main consumers of this intervention. The goal of this study is that parents will be able to receive photos that teachers have taken using mobile technologies at home, maybe texted to them or emailed to them, whatever the parent prefers, and they can use that as a support in talking to their child about their day. So what do parents think about that? Is that an effective intervention for them? Do they like it? Do they feel like it works for their kid? So ultimately, right, we really want to help kids answer this sort of age-old question. How was your day at school? And what we're finding from this study and looking at the interviews that we've done with families is that families are working really hard to get this information from their kid. They're asking a ton of really specific questions. They tend to start really broad. They'll say things like, how was your day at preschool today? And the participants in our study often don't really answer that right away, or they'll give kind of a really routine answer like, oh, it's good, I played. And mom's like, oh, you played? What did you play with? Who did you play with? And when the child doesn't answer that, they're following up with even more specific questions. Did you play with Susie? Did you read this book at recess? Did teacher Marsan do yoga in gym? And parents are getting more and more and more specific. And at that point, some of our participants are kind of able to have a conversation about their day, but it's still a huge challenge. So parents are working hard. We want to see if mobile technologies can create visuals that make this conversation a little bit easier. So these are some examples of photos that Tara and I took. Some of them, most of these are from our pilot study over the summer, that were used as visual supports and ultimately sent to families. So when we're collecting this data and making these visuals, what we're really looking for are events that stick out in a child's mind. So things that seem interesting to a kid. We know that children are more apt to remember really novel events that happen during the day, kind of much like we are as adults. So we wouldn't necessarily take a picture of a kid sitting really nicely and passively at a circle. We're not interested in that. We don't anticipate that a child would want to have a long conversation with a parent about sitting at circle. But it might be more likely that a child who really enjoys water play would be interested in sharing information about how he got to do the slip and slide during the summer camp. We see a photo up here of a little girl who is really interested in the pigeon books, and this is actually a board game. The pigeon books are, don't let the pigeon ride the bus, don't let the pigeon stay up late. And she's playing a board game here with a preferred peer. Got a photo of that. In this photo, actually, kids are on a fire drill. So they were evacuating the building, they're outside playing Ring Around the Rosie, and we assume that that's a pretty novel event. It doesn't happen every day. might be likely that would stick out in a child's mind. Finally, the final picture we see here is a little guy playing with shaving cream, at small group. And again, shaving cream wasn't a thing that was accessible to the kids all of the time. It seems like that's something that would be novel for him, so that's what we would take a picture of. So we're really looking at things that have, that would stick out in a child's mind, not necessarily routine things that they're doing every day, like lining up or sitting at circle or eating kind of a regular snack. So these are examples of the photos that we sent to families and the photos that we used as visual supports. So what do we know about memory and recall? How do kids learn this skill? How do typically developing kids learn to remember? We know for young children, and the kind of the earliest memories, most of the literature suggests that kids begin to develop these memories around age 2, and then they sort of get better at being able to talk about their memories. And as their language improves, they can share more, and their memory improves as well. We know that self-experience events are always easier for kids to remember. So it's easier for me to remember that I built this really big, awesome tower in the block area than it would be for me to remember that my friend Bobby built a big tower in the block area. So things that kids do themselves are easier for them to remember, which makes sense. Novel events also stick out in their mind. So that's why we're not taking photos of like a normal snack time, because kids have snack every single day, and our snack here tends to be pretty similar on a regular basis. But if someone's having a cupcake at snack because we were celebrating a birthday party, that's more of a novel event and would likely stick out in the child's mind. Finally, it's interesting to note that memories are sort of developed around expectations. So kids begin with a script or a schema, and this often looks like if you ask a child, what happened when we went to the grocery store? 3 and 4-year-olds are usually able to tell us, oh, we went in the car and then we sat in the shopping cart and we walked through the store and we came home. What's harder for them is to remember we bought peanut butter and then we got cookies and then mom bought flowers. So they tend to remember the sequence of events and they can talk about these in temporal order, but they have a harder time when they're very young, between 2, 3 and a half, up to 4, kind of talking about the details that happen. We also know that there's a lot of literature that suggests conversations with parents are a huge piece of this puzzle. So the more families talk to their kids about events that they experience as a family, and the more particular WH questions that start with why, what, how, when, the more questions like that parents embed within these conversations, these are correlated with kids developing more sophisticated memory later on. So an example might be if a family goes to the zoo, on the car on the way home, caregiver might be talking about, we went to the zoo, do you remember what we saw? Did we see a bear? Did we see a white bear? Or did we see a brown bear? Who did we see swimming in the cold, cold water? What did we do after we saw the giraffe? What was the rhinoceros doing? And kids aren't able to answer all those questions yet, but by embedding those questions, parents are able to talk about more comments and really have a conversation with their kid about what happened. And those conversations are documented in the literature as being related to kids developing more sophisticated memories later on. Additionally, several studies have looked at showing kids or taking kids back to specific areas or specific parts of their environment and asking them questions like, do you remember what happened here? We're standing in front of a fountain. Do you remember what we did at the fountain? That tends to jog a kid's memory, kind of the same way that if we're forgetting something and we see a water bottle and I say, oh geez, I need to remember to take my vitamin when I get home. So seeing things in their environment tends to jog their memories in a similar way that our memories would be jogged as well. So let's talk now about the recent and the current studies that have been happening here. In both studies, we're looking at 3 children who participate in preschool and in the extended day program here. So the extended day program is specifically for kids with a diagnosis of autism. So all of these kids had a diagnosis of autism. And we took all of these photographs in their preschool classrooms. And the reason we chose to do it in preschool and not an extended day is because the extended day classroom is a bit more individualized and there's not as much access to typically developing peers in there. They're not using a general education curriculum, and it's more likely that these novel events that we want to document and create visuals of are happening in preschool than they are in extended day. So all of our photos were taken in the preschool environment. And then we did intervention with kids as we were sitting down and showing them these images and talking about their day, either right after preschool or in their extended day classroom if that happened after preschool. And our results were pretty exciting. Across both studies, the pilot study and the current study, when we're using these visual supports and mobile technologies, 100% of the kids were able to accurately recall. So they could tell us what happened at school, and they started adding in more information, even that wasn't included in the photo. We also saw kids using richer language. So they're using more words overall, and they're using different vocabulary words than they were using when we weren't using the visuals. We also saw less challenging behavior. Now, one of our participants, a little girl, like I said, with autism, when she was unsure, when we were asking her questions without the visuals, hey, what happened at preschool today? What did you do? She wasn't quite sure how to answer those questions, so she would revert back to using a script. And scripting is a very common thing that children with autism, individuals with autism, may engage in, where I kind of just talk about my favorite TV show or say my favorite song over and over and over again, but it's not functional communication that's really going to result in any sort of back and forth conversation with anyone in my environment. And that's what this little girl would do. She knew she needed to answer, but she had a hard time accurately answering the question and wasn't really sure of the expectation. When we're using the visuals and the mobile technologies, we don't hear that from her at all. She's able to talk about what happened. She's actually starting to remember things that didn't happen in the pictures and talk about those. And we're starting to see, so families have been kind enough to work with us on this study, and they are audio recording their interactions with kids at home when they ask them about their day about once per week. And the kids that are participating in the current study are starting to remember things and share that with parents at home, even without visuals. And finally, a large part of this study, the data we're collecting, is qualitative data with families pre and post. So we sit down with families and basically are asking them a bunch of questions and doing an interview to try to determine what their children are currently talking about, what families hope to get from this intervention, and then ultimately to find out, does this intervention work for families? Do they like it? Would they want to continue doing it? And so far we've had really high social validity among families. They've said, yes, this works, we would love to continue. It's changed the way that we can talk about our child, and we are hearing more about what they're doing during the day. So I'm going to briefly go over these graphs. Now, one of the main dependent variable that we were looking at is children's accuracy. So what I'd like to draw your attention to is in this first phase here, we're not using any photographs. We're just asking kids, what happened in your preschool day? Tell me about your day at school. And their accuracy, as you can see, everyone's accuracy is very low. So kids at this point either were telling us, I don't know, I don't remember, or saying kind of really generic things that we weren't counting as kind of a correct response. Things like, I played. I said hi to my friends. So they weren't able to recall details or recall those novel events. And when we introduce photos, we see for all participants, accuracy shot right up. So with the visual support, they're able to tell us, oh yeah, we did yoga today, and I did a pose where I was a dog, and then I went on the tire swing, and then we painted with shaving cream, or whatever that might be. What's interesting in the pilot study is that when we removed the visuals and we went back to just asking kids about their day, S and N, two of our participants, their accuracy went back down. They hadn't learned this skill. They weren't yet able to tell us without a visual what happened during the day. But that was not the case with A. This little guy learned it right away and was able to tell us about his day, what he did at preschool, what book he read, and the fact that it was his friend's birthday party without any visual. And then we see accuracy jump back up when we introduce the visuals again. Another thing that we are taking data on is the total words that kids use. And what we notice here is the general patterns for N tend to be kind of low. She's using more words when we're using visuals. Her words are going back down when we've taken away the photos, and they're popping back up when we introduce the photos again. A was an interesting kid. What he would do when the photos weren't present, he would kind of just talk about his environment. He sort of knew that he needed to answer a question, but he wasn't quite sure how to do that, and he would kind of just say like, oh look, there's a microphone and a water bottle, and I see a table, and I see a garbage can over there. We're like, okay, well tell us about preschool. He's like, oh, but look, there's a carpet and there's this. So he was talking to us, but he wasn't answering the question and he wasn't accurately recalling. We see similar trends in the current study. So the current study is still going on. We're not completed with it yet. But as we can see here, when we're looking at the total words that kids are using, With no photos, they're relatively low. With all the kids, they're under about 50 words per interaction. And when we introduce the photos, they're able to talk a lot more. They're more motivated to talk. They want to share this information with us. And we see much higher levels of the total words that kids are using. We see the same thing with different words, so another measure of ours. Low different words without photos. When we're introducing the photos, we're seeing a large increase there. Another exciting thing about the study is these parent interviews I mentioned. So we did qualitative interviews with everyone pre and post. And what we saw was pretty high social validity, as I mentioned before. One parent shared with us, before I didn't hear a lot from his teachers. I heard mainly about accidents. And this was a kid that has kind of a specific blood disorder, so it's important that mom be notified if he does get a bump or a bruise or something like that, because it could turn into something more serious. And mom shared, I didn't really hear a lot. I heard about accidents, but I didn't get a lot of other information day to day. But now he's mentioning so much more. I'm starting to hear about his friends, and before I only heard about one other kid. Another parent, so one of the questions we asked is, hey, would you like to continue this study? If that was a possibility, would you want to keep doing this? And this mom said, yes, I would love to continue. We look at the pictures before we go to bed, and he loves to show them to his dad. And this was a dad who had a pretty rigorous work schedule and wasn't able to come in to the Haring Center to see his child and to connect with the child's team the way mom was. So dad really had no idea what was happening at school, and being able to share these photos with the family was a way for him to connect with what his son was doing at school all day. And then the final parent shared with us, before we didn't have that kind of rich conversation where he's sharing. It was a lot harder, it wasn't as interesting, and it seems like having the picture really helped him focus and kind of anchor their conversation on whatever happened at school that day. So we did get exciting kind of data from families, and it seemed like this was something that every family we surveyed and interviewed was interested in continuing with us. So what are the implications for research like this? Well, we think that there's implications for classrooms, for home, and then for individuals. For classrooms, it seems like mobile technologies could be a really easy way for teachers to begin to document what kids are doing and share that with kids at the end of the day. So we know visuals can be used to teach new skills. Could teachers use an iPad or a smartphone to take photos of kids and show those to the whole group at the end of the day, maybe as they're doing a closing circle or walking out to the bus? Additionally, this might be a really easy way, and many of the teachers at the Haring Center are already doing this, in sharing what kids are doing on a regular basis with families. So instead of sending a note home or having a communication log in the child's backpack, perhaps taking a photo using a tablet or a smartphone would be a really easy way to share that information and for families to see what their child's doing at school. When we look at how the implications for this at home, we know that these visuals might be able to help support parent-child interaction. So parents report being able to have better, richer, easier conversations with their children about their day. We know that parent-child interactions and children spending a lot of time in a language-rich environment is correlated with better outcomes across the lifespan. Is it possible that these photos could be used as a tool for that? And then finally, looking at individuals with disabilities, how might we be able to teach a child with a disability or a teenager with a disability to use a mobile technology, like a smartphone or a tablet, to take a photo that might be a reminder later on? So if I need to do my social studies homework, could I take a picture of my social studies book, and would that be a good reminder for me to make sure I put that in my backpack before I leave for the day? Or can I take a picture of something that I want to tell my friend about after school and use that as a visual when I'm having that conversation with a friend? So it seems like, the study's in its infancy. We're just starting, we did the pilot, and now we're just kind of getting ramped up and starting the intervention again. It seems like there might be implications for individuals, for parents at home, and for classrooms. Now, thank you for your participation. Can I answer any questions? Angela.
I like what you were saying about parent-child interactions changing a little bit at home, because I'm imagining, and I'm not sure if this is the case in your study, but I'm imagining that when kids are bringing these pictures home, it helps parents to change their behavior as well in asking the questions, and not just the kids in their recall, right? So our parents having a natural conversation, they're not having to ask the same questions, right? So
absolutely. In kind of coding that data from families, we see parents are able to use more comments and and say like, whoa, it looks like I'm noticing that you guys were doing yoga in gym today. It looks like you were doing a tree pose or whatever. Whereas without visuals, what parents tend to do is ask really specific questions and say things like, what happened in gym? Was Teacher Marsan there? Did you guys read this story? What did you eat at snack? Did you have an animal cracker? Did you have a raspberry? And that doesn't seem to be a really effective way in the data that we're coding for kids to be able to participate in those conversations. So yeah, parents, I think, can use more comments and less questions, and that might feel a bit less demanding to a child with a disability. Yeah.
Cool. And they get even more information than they are getting from their kid, right? Which is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, Mark.
It seemed like at the end here you were thinking about implications in terms of self-management as well, in terms of using the iPad as a way to kind of remind myself that I need to do these tasks.
Right.
And so I think those are great implications for the future, especially for teenagers.
Yeah.
Who have a lot of responsibilities.
Absolutely, and it seems like, as time goes on, we're just going to see the use of these technologies increase, and it's highly likely that, the kids we're serving now in preschool, in 8 years they're going to be in middle school, and they're probably going to be using mobile technologies. I mean, middle schoolers now are using mobile technologies. What will that look like, and how can we teach them to use these to self-manage and create schedules and create reminders for themselves that might look a little bit more age appropriate than having a visual schedule that's got, essentially like cartoon characters on it. Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Marcus. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Dr. Haring?
I like the use of pictures, and it pays off and recall. With, let's say, 2 phases, for example, one the pictures, and then phase 2 with the discussion about the pictures.
Yeah.
And that pays off, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something, we did the pilot, and as we saw, data was low, and it jumped up for accuracy. It was really high for one of the children. And the other 2 kids didn't quite learn that skill of recall. So in the current study, what we're trying to figure out is how do you teach that? And no one has studied this yet. We don't have a lot of literature on how children with disabilities learn to remember. And that's something we're figuring out. If we can just talk to kids about their day or use that as a way to prime them and say like, hey, do you remember today? It was so-and-so's birthday and we did this, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, are kids able to tell us those things if we talk to them about it in the moment? That's what we're kind of trying to parse out and really determine here. How do we teach this specific skill for kids that don't just learn it right away? And conversations seem like a huge part of that.
Did you provide opportunities to see about the application of various settings? And if so, what relation do pictures have enhanced by discussion in terms of the application in other settings with other people?
With this, we haven't kind of systematically separated those 2 things out. With families, we're leaving it really open-ended because we're hoping that this is a practice that they can just easily kind of uptake in their routine. So we don't give them a lot of direction around how to use the photos. But it seems like that is a really interesting place for future studies to go. If we just send these photos and we just have them present in front of children and we don't prompt them and we don't have a conversation, can they start to initiate that with us? Or are they reliant on that conversation initiated by an adult? Yeah.
Well, especially in enhancing the richness of the scene, social relationships going on, a lot of different things. You're finding that discussion around what you see is an important enhancement.
And we are noticing some things that aren't reflected in our data yet. Like kids are able, I did the intervention yesterday with a little girl, and we had a photo of her. She was pretending something in dramatic play of her preschool classroom was a shower. And that's what I had seen in the classroom. I knew that that was accurate. And then she also started telling me about other things that she was doing in the classroom that I didn't see that weren't reflected in the photograph. But when I checked with the preschool teacher, the teacher said, well, yeah, that did happen. After they were pretending this in dramatic play, then she and this other girl did do that. So this is another thing that we're kind of figuring out how to track that as well, and so far we're just taking anecdotal notes, but it seems like these photos for this particular participant are really jogging her memory in a really effective way, and she's remembering things that aren't in her visual, but still did happen.
It is proof, isn't it, that neurophysiology pays off, that the more you connect in the instructional process, the greater the possibility of transfer and generalization.
Absolutely.
Because the firing of the central nervous system is enriched, so that you're getting a wealthier circular involved in the neurophysiology of it.
And more opportunities for that if parents can do this at home with their children. Yeah, absolutely.
So it pays off.
Hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
It's a lot of work, but it doesn't.
It's really promising to hear such great feedback from families sharing with us. Yeah, we want to continue with this. Can you send us more pictures? We're noticing he's able to talk to us about what he does when he's with other family members that we weren't hearing before. So that's an exciting part. Yeah, absolutely.
That's worthwhile. That is really worthwhile.
Yeah, that seems very useful. Yeah, Marcus.
In the social validity interviews, did you have any concerns with teachers about, because I know when you're doing the research is just pictures, but the teachers having the time to actually take these pictures and look for those interesting events with the children.
Yeah. So right now it's a research team that's taking photos. In the pilot study, it was Tara and myself that were taking photos. And the reason why we're starting here is we want to kind of systematically be able to do this before we think about generalizing it to, like you're mentioning, a very busy preschool teacher. Absolutely, caseloads are high when you're a preschool teacher. It's a very challenging job. And that is something that we're doing social validity measures with teachers at the end of this study to determine, was this okay with you? We're in your classrooms a lot, where all the teachers are so kind to check our accuracy. We'll check in with them at the end of the day. Did this happen? Did this kid really earn the iPad? Did your classroom really, yesterday a kid told me, I was looking for Earl the eel, and I assumed that this was a cartoon, and it was actually something that did happen in the classroom. So teachers are a great resource for us in that sense, but you make a great point. It's a busy job when you're a preschool teacher, and there's a lot of things that are already on their caseload. What is promising about this is they're already using mobile technologies in so many early childhood classrooms as a part of Teaching Strategies Gold. So we have the smartphones and the tablets already out. So maybe using those to collect this data and create these visuals isn't that much of a stretch, but we haven't studied that yet with teachers. That's a great question. Andrew, were you going to say something?
I was just thinking about being a teacher and how a lot of times you would write these long notes home to parents.
Right, absolutely.
And that you could do pictures for so many kids at the same time that you could write a note for one kid.
Right.
And how cool that would be to be able to send those home instead. And then the discussion's generated more by what's interesting to the child about that picture rather than what the teacher thought. In some way it still is because it's what the teacher took a picture of, but the kid can expand on that on their own rather than just the parent reading what the teacher thought about it.
Yeah,
cool.
that's
so there's a time lag.
Right. Then maybe this is a more efficient way for teachers to really engage in high levels of parent communication compared to more traditional pencil and paper notes home. Yeah, absolutely.
Is it reasonable for me to assume that this is part of the acquisition that's important? In other words, the more stimuli you can provide in relation to the activity, the better the probability is that you can repeat that at different settings, at different times, different relationships.
I think the more stimuli we can provide for a child about a novel event will contribute to them developing better accurate recall of that event at a later time. But I'm not sure that we have that data yet to back up that statement until the study is completed. Eileen, were you going to say something?
I was just wondering what you would do next. So, I know this is going to be your dissertation, and some people consider that kind of a launching place. But what would be the next step of research that you'd like to do on this stuff?
We did this talk in the morning, and someone asked a question that I hadn't thought about before, but how can we compare, kind of like Angela was saying, a lot of teachers are already using a pencil and paper kind of way to communicate with families. could we compare this way of parent communication with a more traditional pencil and paper email home and kind of determine what works better for families and teachers there? Given the prevalence of mobile technologies in early childhood classrooms, I think that would be really interesting. That gets away from the recall, but anything we could do to support teachers in communicating with families on a regular basis seems highly, highly important. Additionally, like I said before, no one is really studying that I've been able to find how kids with disabilities learn to remember and what child characteristics lend themselves to interventions like this. So if we know visuals and conversations are a way that we can teach memory, how can we start to fade that back in a more systematic way so more interventionists can use technologies and use strategies like this to promote that skill across a wider range of kids? So kind of looking systematically, how do we teach memory to a 4-year-old with autism? What are the strategies for that? What's the scope and sequence of that? And how can we teach a wider range of adults to provide that service? Yeah, Hillary.
I just had a comment. We've kind of done like there was in our classroom with this little stuffed animal Ted, or there's also a prairie dog Perry, and the kids take him home for the weekend, and the parents document what the kids do with the stuffed animal, like they take him to the park or he eats lunch with them. Anyway, so I just kind of noticed that that really helps when the kid is like brought up during circle time with the teacher, and other students ask like, what did you do?
Yeah.
And so like normally the child will kind of like look at the pictures and point and say, you know, look, we went to the park, where did you go? And so yeah, I just kind of noticed that with the pictures that really helps the conversation of like remembering what they did over the weekend too, which I thought was really, really cool. A good like memory.
Right.
Yeah.
What a great class-wide intervention that is, and I'm sure kids and families love it. And then do you keep a photo album of all the photos?
Yeah, it's a really great album of just like, so then when the kids can like look through the binder of like what all their friends have done with Ted and Perry.
That's a great idea. What a cool class-wide intervention. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Marcus.
I'm talking a lot. When I got consent for my capstone, and it involves playing, it's the notion of initiating with peers.
Yeah.
It involves videotaping as well. The parent really was excited to, because she doesn't really see a lot of her kid at school.
Right.
She was really excited to she wanted those videos.
Yeah, of course.
She was asking me so much, can I have those videos?
Can you send those to me? I would love to
can you
see.
send those to me as much as possible? I said, of course. And I think it really helps parents connect with their child at home, like what video or picture.
And in every, there's so much literature on high quality preschool programs and specifically comprehensive treatment models for young children with autism. And a high level of family involvement is always included within those recommendations. And it seems like this is an easy way that we can really promote and incorporate high family involvement. When we serve a lot of families where both parents work and they can't come in and observe and spend the time that they want to spend getting to know their child and getting to know their child in this environment. And it seems like these mobile technologies are one way to kind of bridge that gap in a world where families are busy, and here in Seattle, many of our families, both parents work and they don't have the time. They're time poor. They don't have the time to come in and observe and touch base with teachers that drop off the way other families are able